Welcome to My Life, Chassidus Applied, episode 215. We're in the week of Parso'os Shelach, and according to the directive of the Alter Rebbe, that we live with the times, so we'll begin with speaking about living with this time, the time when we read this chapter. It is the fourth chapter in the book of Bamidbar Noschi Ba'aleischa Shelach, and it has the story of one of the most tragic and most momentous events that shaped actually all of history, and that is the story of the scouts. Shlach lecha anoshim, God says to Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, send to you, lecha, to you, men of stature. And he chose the heads of the 12 tribes, send them to Israel to scout out the land and see which is the best way to conquer the land that we're about to enter, the promised land. And what happens indeed, Moshe chooses the best. That moment, at that point they were kosher, meaning they were appropriate choices. They were not bad people, they were good people, leaders actually, great people. And then they went on to their journey, on their mission, and they came back with a terrible report, how bad Eretz Yisrael is, and that it's a land that we cannot conquer, a land with giants. We are unable to vanquish it. And the classic words that they used was Eretz Eicheles Yeshveh, a land that consumes its inhabitants. And as such, they caused great grief to the entire Jewish people, who said, why are we going? Why did you bring us out of Egypt? And with their complaints, and this was a night of tears and crying, and that's when Hashem says, oh, they want to cry, this will be a b'chia l'deidus, crying for generations. This will be the night of Tisha B'Av, which later, of course, will also be a night of crying for other tragic events that would happen, as the Mishnah says in Tainus, the 5 tragic events, beginning with the dibus ha'aretz, basically the slander of the land that the scouts initiated. Except for 2 of the 12, all 10, the consensus was, this is not a place we can go to. Who were the 2? Kalev and Yeshua. For the very different reasons, Kalev went to the Hebron to pray at the Marasa Machpelah. Yeshua, Moshe Rabbeinu prayed for him. So they were not caught up in this conspiracy, in this plot. On the contrary, they declared and announced and said, absolutely, this is the land, the promised land that God gave us, and we can absolutely conquer it. And the story goes through all the details, which I'm not going to go through, but this is the gist of it. The big question, of course, is what happened here? What is this story? In that moment, when they were sent, they were fine. Not only fine, as I said, they were the best. What happened? And didn't they do what they asked to do? They were asked to go and scout out the land, and they came back with this report. That's when they asked to do that. Why is a crime here? So when you look deeper into the story, to start with the first verse, Shlach lecha. What's the addition of the word lecha? So Rashi says, why does it say Shlach anoshim? Send men, send scouts, send meraglim. Why does it say lecha? So Rashi says, Hashem says, Ani lo mitzava escha. I'm not commanding you. Lecha, l'daitecha. You're doing it at your own initiative, which immediately should have aroused concern by Moshe Rabbeinu. Kol ha'teira kula, God tells him exactly what to do. He never says, lecha, I'm not telling you what to do, it's up to you. As soon as he heard that, he should have right away raised a red flag and say something's wrong. And indeed, what is the reason that suddenly l'shlach lecha? And that itself is a command of God. It doesn't say Moshe came up with an idea. It says God told him, do it at your initiative. What does that mean? And a few more questions just to make the plot thicken. If indeed there was such a terrible thing, that you would imagine that this shouldn't be done again. And yet, we find in the Haftarah of this week, Yeshua sends Meraglim again when he's about to enter the promised land. Why was he not concerned after he saw what happened? And Moshe again also sends Meraglim in the next week's Parsha, Chukas. So what's going on here? And above all, Torah Melosh Nehirah. Torah, the application, applied Torah, applied Chassidus, applying Torah to our lives. What is the application to our personal lives? And the answer briefly, which is a summation of the Maamar Chassidus, both in Likutei Torah and the other Rabbeim, and of course as all seen through the lens and the explanations of the Rebbe, is that this was not just a small event, it's an event that's a lesson and a directive, a timeless directive to all of us. But first let's begin with the actual story. They were going to scour the land, as the Ramban says, because that's the way. B'derech hateva, you don't rely on miracles. Before you go conquer a land that's inhabited by others, especially people who were sworn enemies, you go and scout out to see which is the best way to enter, which is where the weak defenses, the fortresses. The Ramban elaborates beautifully in the beginning of this week's Parsha Shelach. So that was the purpose of going. Moshe told them to go in order to scout out the land. He never said to them, come back and tell us whether we can conquer the land. Their great sin, grave sin, was not that they came back with a report, that they came to a conclusion that they were never asked. The shlichus was figure out how to enter the promised land. The promised land is one promised to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. The Eden knew that the whole years they were in Golus Mitzrayim, they could not wait to go back to their homeland. So now suddenly you're coming and saying we can't enter. That was not what we were asked for. That was their sin. And how taka noshim kshedim, such people of stature, on such a level, the heads of tribes can come to such a mistake and make such a sin, is precisely because of their spirituality, and they saw the material world and its challenges. They said, it's much more comfortable to live here in the Midbar, where we're protected by the clouds of glory, where we get bread from heaven and miraculous water. Why have to enter the marketplace, the stock market, the Wall Street, and all the struggles that one has to deal with in material life? Materialism on a deeper level is more powerful than us. It's much easier to isolate yourself, to live insulated, an ascetic lifestyle. But that's not the kavanah. Of course a neshama prefers to live in Gan Eden. And that's why al korcha chatachai, God has to compel it to go down. But it goes. You have to figure out how to accomplish the mission, not whether to accomplish the mission. So that was their grave sin. And it was precisely because of their great heights and their stature that they were sensitive, and they said to themselves and convinced other Jews, this is not a place for us, but we will just be overwhelmed and consumed, a land that consumes its inhabitants. Like we see many people enter the material world, it's very difficult. You compromise your values, the corruption, the greed, and everything else that comes a person's way. So why not live in the Kollel, in a Beis Medrash, in the secluded, in the insulated environment, surrounded by Anani HaKovid? What's the lecha? The lecha is because in every person's Aveda, there's God commanding us to do things, but then there's things we need to do on our effort. God said you enter the promised land, but now you have to do something, and this itself is a command, to use the resources I've given you, your intelligence, to figure out how to enter the land. Not whether, as I just mentioned. And that's why Moshe was not concerned at all. He heard lecha, he understood very well. Commands were given. Now the time has come for us to use our intelligence, our tools, our resources, which we're also blessed with, make sure they're aligned with what God wants us to do. That's part of the Yerid. In many ways, it's much more comfortable to stay in a kollel and stay in a yeshiva and stay in your mother's womb. There you don't have the lecha, and you don't have all these concerns. Maybe that itself is what the Meraglim did not like, the idea of a lecha. But Moshe understood what the point is. He knew there's a risk. But nevertheless, this is the kavanah. This is the kavanah that God is not going to just hold our hand every moment. We have to use our resources maturely and enter the promised land and figure out the best way to do so. So you have everything here, the whole Seder of Aveda is here. In a way, it's a continuing theme of Ba'alescha Saneda Shalheva Selam Elah that we spoke about last week, of such an emphasis in Torah B'chlal and Chassidus specifically, and the Rebbe's approach, even more specifically, that what Aveda B'keach Atzmei, that it's not just enough to light a flame, the flame has to rise on its own. Shelach lecha, it's not just enough to follow orders, but you have to use your lecha, you have to use your faculties. So entering the promised land is the Aveda of every person. We all have a mission to accomplish and reach our promised land. Promised land, Beruchnius, is Migdal Yisrael, to sanctify the corner of our world for divine purposes. So we all have that, and we have a journey going there. We go a journey through Midbar Amim. And in the journey we are protected and given resources, but we have to use our resources to make a dira b'tachtenim, to make a home for the divine in this material world. And there are risks. So that's why you have to be zugibun eben, fällt man nicht unten. When you're tied above, you don't fall below. Kolav in Yeshua had keiches, extra keiches. So though they also saw the frightful sight of a land that is so powerful that could consume its inhabitants, but they knew that we're going with the koyach of something greater. Koyach of the Rebbe, the koyach of Moshe Rabbeinu, the koyach of the Eibishter, that gives us the power to enter there and can fulfill what we were sent to do, which is how, not whether. And that was the great sin, because they challenged the very plan itself. The plan is that you have to enter there and you have to figure out how, and you have to do it the best possible way, and you have all the keiches and all the faculties and resources necessary. So it's a tremendous lesson in life. Each of us are going to face situations where sometimes it seems like Eretz Eicheles Yishveh. We may meet difficult people. We live in a hostile world. We sometimes encounter, unfortunately, greed, corruption, and other of the weak human vices that can be so debilitating and demoralizing. And it's very easy to say, you know what, to retreat. I can't do it. I'd rather stay in a more safer environment. But that's not the mission. The mission is absolutely go there, armed with resources. And you don't have to spend 24/7 there. Obviously, there's a Shabbos, there's our childhood when we have our education. But now the time has come to go. You have to figure out how to conquer, how to transform, how to sublimate the material world and turn it into, and harness it, and turn it into a channel for spiritual expression and divine higher consciousness. That is the lesson. And it's a lesson every one of us, because whatever we do in life, we are going to encounter impediments, meniyas v'ikuvim, difficulties, like the Meraglim did. And you don't want to repeat, God forbid, that grave sin, that I can't do it. You can always do it. You have to find the strength and find others that help you with the strength and pray. And yes, go to the Kivrei Avis or to the oil and other ways that we glean and gather strength in order to be able to achieve the primary mission. And when one does, God forbid, what they did, it opens up the door to all the other b'chiyas, the crying, ultimate destruction of the temple even, because it's like saying, we can't do it. You can't do it. There are consequences when a person comes to that conclusion. But let's talk about the positive. And this is what Chassidus came to give us from the Rebbeim, the tools and resources, especially in this last days of Geulah. As we come to the Geulah, to have the ability and the confidence and the resources to know that every situation can be conquered. A lesson right from the beginning of Shelach and generally the general gist of the entire parsha. Okay. With that, let us go to some questions. And before that, let me make some announcements. This program is community sponsored. It's a free program. A lot of work goes into it, a lot of research and time and energy. So please help us continue and expand the program. There are many ways that we can expand it by simply making a generous sponsorship, a generous dedication in the honor of a loved one or memory of a loved one, simply by going to meaningfullife.com/sponsorship. We also have the forum I always announce where you can submit any question. Nothing is off limits. We will try to address every question. There is a backup, but they will be addressed in time. And that is to go to meaningfullife.com/mylife. There you have, number one, the forum. You also have an array of resources, including the previous episodes, the archives, as well as essays for the last 4 years. Now, of course, we're posting the 4th year of the essay contest, which I always review at the end of the program, 3 new essays, and other materials that you can definitely use and share with others. At this point, you can search, and every topic that has been addressed is timestamped on the YouTube videos. So you can really find any topic, almost every topic that we addressed in the last 214 episodes. With that, let us go to some questions, some new questions. And they are, let's start with the first question. Why recite? Well, before I go to that, I always seem to forget. There was previous programs I want to cross-reference to the archives where I spoke about Shelach, episode 70, 120, and 166. And now to the question. Why recite a Maamar Chassidus when most people don't understand? And here's how the writer writes it, unfiltered, uncensored. The boring Maamar time after Mincha on Shabbos. Referring to a custom that's in the yeshivas and many shuls, Chassidic shuls, Chabad shuls, where they sing some nigunim after Mincha, between Mincha and Ma'ariv on Shabbos. And the longer, when it's longer nights, or the shorter when Shabbos starts earlier, the minig is to do it on Friday evening. Some do it both. And then someone chazes a Maamar sometimes, Abba Yemaledes, or someone else chazes a Maamar. So this person is referring to the boring Maamar time after Mincha on Shabbos. Is there a point and meaning in the veteran Chabad minig of saying a Maamar in shul after Mincha in a way that, between me and you, no one is able to follow and understand? Okay, now it's no longer between me and you because I've announced it now for the thousands of viewers, and it's out there now in cyberspace. That's my addition. It was a recent Hayem that mentioned something about the neshama understanding the words of Chassidus. Is this lechatchila or b'diavad? Meaning, the neshama understands. Lechatchila means that's what we have to rely on. Or is that a backup in case we don't understand it? We say at least the neshama understands. That's what this questioner is asking. Should Chassidus be taught in a way that warrants and demands an exclusive neshama understanding? What happened to Chabad and understanding? Chabad as in Chachma Bina Das. What about our Nefesh Habam is getting on board? Of course, Chassidus talks about that as well. The animal soul also appreciating it. This leads to more of a general question. And we'll get to that in the second question. So let me just respond to this question. Very good question, and I'm glad you ask it, even though it's irreverent, and some people say, why chutzpah to challenge a minig that the Rebbeim instituted, a minig that Chassidim do, and it's beautiful minig, people cut together, they sing Nugunim, it's a Haesedus, Maamar Chassidus. But nevertheless, you ask the question, and maybe other people ask the same question. The question really can be broadened not just to the Mincha minig, but also in general learning Chassidus and not feeling you understand, which we'll soon discuss as more at length. You could also say it about Torah in general. People learn Gemara and they don't feel they understand. So the question can be broadened in general. People daven and they don't feel they understand davening. So what's going on here? Are we just doing things mechanically? We're just relying on the miracle the neshama will understand. So let me begin from the top. Let's start like this. First of all, yes, the neshama does understand. So even if you don't always physically understand it with your mind and with your just because it's done in a way where people don't understand it, that doesn't mean it's right. So the minig, even if you didn't understand, I wouldn't stop it because God forbid, when you say holy words of the Rebbeim, just like you say holy words of davening, you're saying words that have power. And they have power to affect the neshama, and they have power to affect the beruchnias, and sheidah shenyanim, as Chassidus explains. But the kavanah is absolutely, so say a Maamar and get someone to say a Maamar in a way that people do understand. I've been to Maimorim that have been said by people, beautiful to hear, explaining it. Just because it's this way it's done, this doesn't mean it has to be done this way. So the absolute reason to do this is absolutely to do it the right way. Same thing in yeshiva. We're going to talk about it some more in a moment, about learning and studying. But the same thing is in yeshiva. When you're learning Chassidus, you can learn in a way that's just mechanical, lip service, or you can learn in a way that's gishmak and meididik. You find a number of sichas where the Rebbe says, how could someone not have gishmak in Chassidus? So people say, they learn and they don't understand it. It's not being taught right. There's a famous expression, imreiku mikemhu. If there's a problem, it's not coming from the source, God forbid, it's coming from the way we are learning it. So this is a challenge. This is exactly one of the reasons I do My Life Chassidus Applied, is to bring out the richness of Chassidus, that we should all appreciate it that way. And Torah in general. So that's the answer to the question. And absolutely Nefesh Habam should understand it. So that's our challenge. Let's put our heads together and figure out how to chazam Maimorim in a way that's understandable, and how to do it in a way that people can appreciate and fully benefit from it and apply it to their lives. Now, obviously, when you chazer a maimer, there's the element of chazering a maimer that, just as I said, the words of the Rabbeim themselves have value. What's the value? Because the words have that type of power. But there's no chassadim to have that plus an understanding and relating it to our lives. So in Chazer HaMaimer, you want to stick to the original. It's not a time to explain the Maimer. But that doesn't mean it can be said in a beautiful way, in a way that does have some explanation, at least the pshat of it, and said in a way, even in the language, that people can relate to and understand. So that's my response to that. Now, that leads to the second question that you asked, and that second question is, what is in essence the difference between a sicha and a maimer? Or is there a difference? A maimer is known as divrei Elokim Chaim, right? The words of the living God. Now, the Rebbe once wrote to someone that when you write, for example, you write the divrei Elokim Chaim, and then you write nigla, it doesn't make sense because nigla is also divrei Elokim Chaim. Is that Chassidus is used as divrei Elokim Chaim, but not chas v'sholom to minimize that other parts in Torah are not from the living God, just as a footnote. But the Maimer is known as divrei Elokim Chaim, correct? And as such, it is a as such, it has the particular power that we say the Shechina medaberes metergrene, the famous story, which means the Shechina speaks through the throat of the Rebbe as he's saying the Maimer, the divrei Elokim Chaim. The famous story. Well, let me continue reading your letter and then I'll tell the story. Is every word of a sicha or ksav yad not the words of a Rebbe who's also referred to as an ish Elokim? Isn't a sicha also the words of the Rebbe, also channeling these words? We know that the Rebbeim spoke in a different tone when saying a maimer than the regular form of speech that was used when saying a sicha. Number one, why? Why was there this different tone? But that's all Rebbe ideas, which I don't need to really understand. Fine, but the bigger question to me is this difference of tone one that Chassidim must adapt to as well. Does a maimer and shul after mincha need to be said in this seemingly non-inviting tone? When the Rebbe spoke so much about the idea of kabolas, kehilas, which is gathering people together, kehilas, community, on Shabbos and chazing Chassidus in shuls in a time of Raiva Deraiven, which is Shabbos afternoon, is this what the Rebbe meant? If yes, how come I never came across a Lubavitcher Bocher or younger man get up in a Williamsburg Borough Park flabber shul and start singing the Maimer tune and talking about Ak and Kesser and which is higher? Anyway, I think you get the point of this question. Extremely looking forward to get clarity on this. So let's talk a moment about that, and I'll go back to the original question and elaborate a bit more. And that is following. So, in looking up this difference in a sicha and a maimer, I recall a letter from the Rebbe, and if anybody knows exactly where it is, I really appreciate you telling me. I try to look for it, where the Rebbe says that both obviously come from a Rebbe, but one is formal and one is informal. Formal means, as we know, maimer is said with a particular niggin. Chassidim rise and listen to the maimer. The Rebbe takes a tichel and ties it, which means there's a hamshachas alakus going on in a formal way. A sicha is in a way off the record conversation about Chassidus or Torah or other parts of Torah and so on. Now, does that mean they're both obviously coming from a Rebbe? But the Rebbe writes in one Yud Beis Tammuz, I believe, in Tofshin Yud Gimel, the Rebbe wrote that Namaimer you're medayik in words. In a sicha you're not medayik, you don't emphasize words. In other words, every word is accounted for. Similar like the difference between Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. So there's Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. The written Torah, every word counts. Now Torah Shebal Peh, the words are also precise, but you don't have the same level of precision as it is in the written Torah. So in a way you can compare the two. The Rebbe also has a letter where he writes, it's in Iglis Kedesh, volume 1, page 190, 191, an interesting letter where he talks about sicha from the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he says in the sicha, what's in the sicha that's not in a maimer is that besides the fact that you have the esrog and the lulav, which become beautified pri hadar, but also the hadas and the arava, even people who don't have any Torah or mitzvahs, you could also have an influence on them. In other words, the sicha is more palatable and more conducive to present to others. A maimer can be sometimes a little too difficult or a little more on a higher, loftier level. But you need both. You need the Kedusha of a Maimer, and you need the so-called the sicha, bringing it down, making it more accessible is the right word I should say. And they both work hand in hand. So that's in that letter. And as I said, there's more material on this. I believe that in the Yem, the Rebbe speaks about his kashas, he says, to learn a Maimer and to read a sicha. So there is a difference. It's not relevant, I believe, to our discussion here, except in this context. A Maimer said, that's why we chazer a Maimer, the Bar Mitzvah Maimer, we chazer word for word exactly as the Rebbe said it, as the Frierdiker Rebbe said it, and as the Rebbe Rashab said it. Same thing with the Chasna Maimer, because there's an inyan of carrying and saying the words exactly as they were given. Then there's an inyan of explaining those words, and that's an additional element, and it's not a contradiction one to the other, as I explained before. Now, the best would be if you chazer the Maimer and you use words to explain it to help. At least, I'm not talking about havana, a whole beer, a pilpul in it. I'm talking about the minimum to explain in a way that allows someone to at least appreciate the points. And a Maimer could be said that way, and we should be training ourselves and our students to say it that way. I did discuss the Bar Mitzvah Maimer in episode 202 in this context as well. So that's a cross-reference. Good. Now, I want to say the story with the Rab Hillel Paritcher was once sitting at the table at Tzemach Tzedek, and they were being mefalpel. They were discussing and analyzing the Maimer that the Tzemach Tzedek said. And there was a certain issue that they had issues with, and they had a disagreement. The Tzemach Tzedek explained it one way, the Rab Hillel explained it a different way. So someone said, Rab Hillel, this is the Rebbe. Who? He said this Maimer. How can you argue with him? Besides that he's the Rebbe, he's also said the Maimer. He says, when he said the Maimer, Rab Hillel responded, it was Kinsinos Messinai. That was Messinai. Now we're talking the seichel of it. And here we're all befalpul. So when Moshe comes down from Har Sinai, I'm explaining, he brings Dvar Hashem, Zu Alocha, this exactly is what the Eibishter said. But then the Eibishter told Moshe, be mefalpul, that you should be able to have a Bezdin, you should have a Sanhedrin that discusses a topic, and you could argue Mem Tes Panim 49 ways this way, and 49 ways this way, and have a consensus. So there's two parts to Torah. There's the Torah as it's given from heaven. That's like a Maamar Chassidus. So there you can't come and say, I have a different opinion on the Maamar Chassidus. That's the way it was given. That's the way it was recited, with all the formalities. A sicha, you could say, is also coming from the Rebbe, but a sicha is a more of a formal presentation. And as such, it has an element, you can say there's more seichel in it. Now, obviously, when the Rebbe says a sicha, we also defer to the Rebbe's sicha. It's not suggesting that we can argue. But in concept, you're not dealing with a pure, let's call it unfiltered flow channeled from above. It's already coming down in a way that is, as I said, more informal, more explanatory, and so on. When we worked in the Sichas HaMamorim, of course, we asked questions on both of them. But the questions were not, God forbid, a disagreement. The questions were just points of clarity. Just wanted to add that point. So, bottom line is, we are blessed with Chassidus. Chassidus has an element of a Kedusha Sa'esius, and there's an element like we learned Tanya Baal Peh, the letters themselves, and then there's explaining. And we really need both. The reason you need the first one, because that brings you, Chassidus explains, that's a reflection of the divine. So you're getting a gili, unfiltered gili from the source. The reason you need the second is because you want to internalize it and integrate it in our lives. If you only had the second, you wouldn't have the gili mamayel, like Chassidus says, Am shacham mamayel lamata, Torah, for instance, and tefillah. Shacham mamayel lamata has the value that is coming down from above, so it has an intensity, you're having a divine revelation. Tefillah, on the other hand, is initiated from below when we have bakashas tzrach of apitera, when you have a need. So it doesn't have that intensity, but it has the internalization. It's much more yours. The shlach lecha is stronger, the lecha. Shall have a selah me'eleh. On the other hand, the same thing can be said with Geit HaMaimer and a sicha. A Maimer in the pure Kedusha says has that gili momayla. That strength. But the advantage of having something internal, that comes when you explain it. And I don't see any reason. Not only no reason, we are commanded, shlach lecha, both, to learn what's said and then explain it and internalize that. When you chazer it, to chazer it with some type of gishmak that you're actually influencing people in a way that they actually appreciate it. The Alter Rebbe, famous story with the Alter Rebbe, that when he was said the Torah in Shklov, and he felt that it wasn't resonating with them, he said, okay, Tamru'u, Kitev Havaya, Fazuchtun Zet, as the Eibishter is good, that only a niggin could pierce their hearts. Now, why didn't the Torah itself? Because the Torah could be sometimes a mile lamat that's coming from the top down. And a song pierces something like tefillah pierces you where you are, and it can touch somebody in a completely different way. And you really need a combination of both elements. So generally it's Torah and tefillah, specifically more Torah shebiksav and Torah shebal peh, the written and the oral Torah. And it could be also in Chassidus, there's the written, which is the Maamar itself, and there's the oral, the way we explain it and we discuss it and present it and apply it to our lives. Next question. This one, so the person who writes with sensitivity, he says, schedule of Temchet Mimim. Is our yeshiva system, what we learn, how we learn, when we learn, based on the Rebbe's guidelines? If so, what can we do if it isn't working for many of our students? Please don't discuss this on your program, the fellow writes, unless you strongly think it's the right thing to do. I don't want to take any responsibility for this. I will speak about it because it's a very relevant topic. So, exactly as I just read, is our yeshiva system, what we learn, how we learn, when we learn, based on the Rebbe's guidelines. If so, what can we do if it isn't working for many of our students? So first, let me give you some cross-reference. I've discussed this in the past, and that is in episodes 24 through 26, episode 52, 63, 68 through 70, 72, and 93, just to show you how relevant this topic is and how it keeps coming up, because obviously it affects us all of us going through the school systems, affects our children, affects the future generations, especially in our challenging times. But with that, I will also address another question that came in. Why did the Rebbe not intervene to improve our yeshiva system? And the writer writes, the following topic is really a painful one. I'm not going to write to you the challenges I find in the mainstream system of yeshivas today. I'm not going to cry out about the 70% of today's precious youth which aren't being catered to in our dozens of beautiful institutions. I hope you are willing to choose not to live in denial and accept the tragic fact as it is. Do I need to illustrate what I'm talking about? My question is this all from the Rebbe? When I speak to others about this, I'm immediately attacked. Are you challenging the Rebbe's system? I want to know, is this indeed the Rebbe's system? Is the fact that 90% of yeshivas today run on 90% of the same schedule and curriculum clearly not captivating and inviting for our today's neshamas? Is this something which the Rebbe created and pushed for? If yes, how are we to understand such a phenomenon? If no, is there anything what we as parents can do about this? Until then, what is to be our message to our children? We can obviously not tell them that the system is corrupt. We have to always take the side of the establishment. So what can we tell them? My son is finishing Mesivta in 2 years. He's going to start looking to choose a Zal, Beis Medrash. Rabbi Jacobson, where am I to send him? To me, his question sounds like, Tati, in which yeshiva will I experience less pain and suffering? The real problem is that this is a subject which we may never talk about, because when it removes the responsibility of the Bocher's shoulders, as if he need not work till the Hanhola gets their act together, which is why I worry this is a question you will feel comfortable addressing altogether. Is there clear directives from the Rebbe regarding the actual structure and schedule of the yeshiva? Did the Rebbe say that Seder Chassidus must be an hour and a half in the morning and at night, and a whole day of intense learning schedule? Does the curriculum need to be about concepts these boys don't know anything about, definitely not care about? There's a limit how long a Talmud can enjoy reading about Ak, Kesed, and which is higher. So if you want to explain these concepts in a clear and meaningful way, go for it. But if not, then maybe they should learn a sicha, or is that also during Seder Chassidus? Okay. I read the questions exactly as they were written, and I do not retreat or hesitate doing so, because I believe the answer is even better than the question. And this is not my answer. This is coming from sichas and letters from the Rebbe, and based on the fundamentals. What bothers me, and this is not, I don't, God forbid, the question is a legitimate question. I've heard it from many people, many people. But I'll tell you what really bothers me, and I'm speaking now just from my own heart personally. The assumption bothers me. It's the same thing we spoke before about the Maamar being boring. I understand that's your experience. I understand that many of us have experienced negative experiences in the yeshiva, or our children have. But why are we suggesting that that's what the Rabbeim intended? Isn't that a given that a Rebbe, who's a Aryeh Yisrael, a shepherd of Israel, a Moshe Rabbeinu, cares about every Jew, and the Rebbeim set up systems. Isn't it obvious or given that they set up systems in order for us to be the best we can be? Chas v'shalom, a corrupt system or a not appropriate system or not fitting? Wouldn't this basic menschlichkeit to appreciate, even if it was a regular person that cares about you, that they're doing something because they're doing it, this is what they think is the best thing for us? The fact that you experience this, the answer is very simple. Maybe it's not being done the way that Rebbeim wanted. That which you suggest, but isn't that the obvious direction to go? To me, it's a given that's the way it is. Or else the whole point, God forbid, to suggest otherwise. What's the whole point of speaking about Chassidus and the Rebbeim if, God forbid, they didn't get it right? I'm just saying that, God forbid, just as an expression, just playing devil's advocate. So it's an absolute given that the systems, the way the Rebbe Rashab set up Timchit Mimim, and the Frierdiker Rebbe implemented, and the Rebbe continued, are holy, and that's the way it is. And it could be done in the best possible way. Yes, learning 1.5 hours Chassidus in the morning, and 1 in the evening, 1.5 in the evening, and all in between. There's a Seder. When the Rebbe, when they established Beit Sefer LeMelacha in Kfar Chabad, and they asked the Rebbe that they wanted it to be under Timchit Mimim and Timchit Mimim, the Rebbe said it has to be separate. Because Timchit Mimim was established the way that Rebbeim established it. It would be like someone saying, we live in the 21st century, and the way the Torah was given 3,330 years ago, it's a different world. Yes, that's applying the Torah in modern times, but never changing the fundamentals. There's a mitzvah says to learn Torah. Shlish Mikra, Shlish Mishnah, Shlish Gemara, etc. There's all kinds of guidelines. There's guidelines that also accommodate Chanechel, Nara Pidarke, different students in different ways. Here's not the place to go into a thorough discussion. But we have an eisen and a brick. We have a solid and unwavering bridge to stand on. Torah in general and the Rebbeim in particular, which is built on Torah. What we have to do is make sure it comes alive for our students. So all the statements you make of children, students not being able to follow, being bored, not understanding, that's because it's not being taught right. And we have to just state that for the record. And if indeed it's not being taught the right way, then it's not we're going to go change the system. Let's, for argument's sake, a human being needs to eat and sleep. And you start eating and sleeping, you're being fed by people who are they're feeding you toxic food, God forbid. Junk food. And your sleeping habits are unhealthy. So what are you going to say? I'm not going to sleep, I'm not going to eat? You say, no, let me learn from somebody who knows how to eat, who knows how to suggest proper hygiene, proper diet, proper exercise. The same thing here. It's our life and our sustenance. Chassidus is the greatest gift. It's a gift that actually provides us with a full, comprehensive blueprint for living. Psychological, emotional, spiritual, dealing with every detail, which is the whole basis of this program. As the Alter Rebbe says in the introduction to Tanya. You say, I don't see it. So, hafachba. Turn it until you find it. Imreiku, if you're empty and you don't see it, mekem. It's from you, the emptiness. Not a critique. It means you need to find the right teachers. But to suggest, let's go back to the story of the Meraglim. What was the chet of the Meraglim? Not that they came back with a bad report, with the report saying that it's challenging. They came to a conclusion, we can't do it. This attitude, this tone, that we pick up our hands like victims. What could we do? If it's the Rebbe system, okay, too bad. It's a terrible system, but it's the Rebbe system. If it's not the Rebbe system, then what do we do? The answer is it's absolutely the system of the Rebbeim. System meaning I'm talking about when to learn and how to learn and what to learn. The point of the fact that no one size fits all. It's not a cookie cutter model, which is unfortunately part of the situation. Different students, different needs. And that's an obvious thing. However, we're not going to go change the whole system because some students, let's say, cannot follow. That's where you have to have good mashpiyim, good Rosh Yeshivas, good educators, good mechanchim, who recognize that a student may be a little slow or another student may be too fast, and recognize how we can customize and tailor the teachings that work for the student. Obviously, absolutely, that's necessary. However, That doesn't mean you go change the system. Just going back to the example of hygiene and diet. We all have to eat. Sometimes a person may need special diet for whatever, supplement and so on. That's part of the system itself. The Rebbe told once a bacher that in every yeshiva established in Temchet Mim, there should be 2 mashpiyim. Because Ein Day Yasayin Shav, students are different, and therefore they can't always, different students relate to different mashpiyim. So he said, choose a mashpiyah and stick with him. Don't go to someone else once you choose him. So obviously we all need that type of customization. So that's the bottom line. The bottom line is the system is a system that Abayim set up, and it has all the flexibility and all the latitude necessary to customize it for every particular situation. As I mentioned before, the different episodes where I addressed this as well, that complements and supplements what I've just said. Why did the Rebbe not intervene? I would say it's a shlach lecha, l'daitecha approach. I can't speak for the Rebbe, I can only speculate. The Rebbe cared, obviously, for every person, for every child, for every student. You see the Rebbe's focus on education, achinuch, the yeshiva, temchet mimim, the yeshiva system for boys and girls. But the Rebbe, shlach lecha, there's a time when it needs a lecha. And the Rebbe was not going to intervene in every particular case, especially as the yeshiva system blossomed. It's one thing in the early Nesias, in general the Rebbe was more hands-on because the people were less pasha begashmis. But more importantly, for sustainable purposes, you need to be able to allow people to have that strength where they develop tools. Where the Rebbe could intervene in general terms, he did. But in a specific way, as much as it was difficult and probably painful for the Rebbe, exercising restraint ultimately created a situation where we have to address our issues and our challenges and go back and forth to ourselves and be able to do that in a way that really applies it and tailors it, as I said before, and in place that can look at the situation. The Rebbe says many times, you can't solve a problem from a distance. You can give general guidelines, but the issues have to be addressed each particular place according to its particular needs. So yes, this is the restraint of every parent and every good leader, where there's shalheva selamei eleha. You want the student to be able to stand on his own feet. So as difficult as it was for the Rebbe to go and spoon feed and babysit and hold our hands, to some extent, to the beginnings, but not on an ongoing basis. That's my way of explaining this point. Okay, next question. Next question is, how to understand the seeming paradox? Is the main focus today on kabolas sale or on making Chassidus understandable and relevant? So here's the paradox. Teichen A, 1 point. In our generation, when there is this phenomenon of nismaito hamechin v'halavavis, in our generation when there's a time of when there's a diminishment in people's intellect and heartfeltness and heart, in other words, they're in their evolved state. The main focus now is on Maaseh B'Peil with Pshittus and Kabbalah sale. That's what we're told. The main focus is on just following what you're told, the Kabbalah sale, accepting Nasa v'Nishma, accepting it without having to understand it all and processing it all in detail. On the other hand, Teichen B, we hear another expression that goes like this. Everything in Chassidus is relevant today, more than ever. The giving out Ekuntes Eitz Chaim in Nun Aleph, when the Rebbe gave it out in Tavshin Nun Aleph, where the Rebbe Rashab teaches how Ava v'Yira is Leba Shamayim Hi. How love and awe is not in heaven. And it's shaykh and relates to everyone. All the sichas, 51 of Tavshin Nun Aleph and Tavshin Nun Beis, etc., etc., etc. What are your thoughts? Okay, very good question. And it's addressed in a number of sichas. Just to cite one where you see this idea discussed, and that is the sicha where the Rebbe speaks in Chelik Tezvav, the sicha of Yutas Kislev, 2 reasons why Chassidus was revealed in the later generations. 1, because the darkness was deeper, so you need a greater Gili light to counter the darkness. You need the most precious stone of the king, the mashal of the Alter Rebbe, to be crushed to perhaps save the child that's ill in a coma. On the other hand, Mashiach is like Erev Shabbos, right before the Geulah, you have a taste of the great revelations that will come when Mashiach comes, which is Primus HaTeira, Teres Chassidus. So, seemingly contradiction. They're like opposite reasons. Says the Rebbe, no. Because Haba Hatali, it's interdependent. Why? Because right before the dawn is the darkest. So in order to give strength to deal with the darkness, that's exactly what happens. To give the strength in the darkest time, you get the greatest Geulah, which is right before the Geulah. You could say a similar thing here. It is true, on one hand, it's ikvasa the Mashiach. Ikvasa means the heal. We don't have the neshamas, the high neshamas that were there by Matan Torah, the neshamas later by the Beis HaMikdash Rishon, Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni. It's much lower. But we also are, so on one hand, it's much lower in neshamas, and therefore kabolas is our main aveda, like he says in the Maamar Bassie Lagani, main aveda, netzach, midas netzach, or hoid and netzach. Netzach and Heid, as I discussed a few weeks ago. On the other hand, however, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So we have all their Geulim, and we're on the threshold of the Geulah. So we also have a tremendous Geulah, and there's a revelation of Chassidus like never before. The Maimorim that the Rebbe said, how the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe explained Chassidus in ways that Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe never heard. So you see there's a tremendous Geulah. You'll say, how does it fit? Both are necessary. One, if you talk mitzad pnimius ha'adam, we are not on that level of understanding perhaps. When you talk about the intensity of the revelation, we have even more than there was there before. And both are respected from us. Kabolas, you don't wait till you internalize it all, but at the same time we have today tools to explain Chassidus and apply Chassidus in ways that we've never had before. As the Rebbe says, when the Frierdiker Rebbe translated Chassidus into other languages, it wasn't just physical translation, it was taking Chassidus and making it accessible and applicable to modern times, as the Rebbe especially did. They didn't have that before. Firstly, they may not have needed it quite. They saw it from above, like the Rishonim saw things that the Achreinim didn't. Mishnah, the Tanoim saw it in the Mishnah, and the Amoraim needed Gemara. So which one is it? Who understands more? So they understood it as a Geulah Milmaila, the higher neshamas. Today, it's Milmata, but Pnimius, much more lamata, so it's much more internalized and more integrated, and therefore it's consistent with the Kabbalah cell, because we may not have all the, like you said, miyatal levavis, the smayatal meichin levavis. We don't have quite that type of level of as it was then, but we have all their strengths plus what we can add in our times. Okay, with that, let us go now to some follow-up. Follow-up to last few weeks. 213 and 214. So first of all, the first follow-up question is this. Novel b'reshus ha'Torah. Hi, Rabbi Jacobs. You mentioned your last few classes the concept of novel, disgusting b'reshus ha'Torah. Yes, this is an expression from the Ramban at the beginning of Parsha Kedeshim, where the Ramban says, someone who's despicable, a manuvel, b'reshus ha'Torah. He's doing it with like reshus ha'Torah. He finds Torah to justify it, which of course is even worse when you do it. I don't understand that statement. If the Torah allows something, then it's not disgusting. As it says, its ways are pleasant. And if something is disgusting, it's not from the Torah. So please explain. Very good question. The answer, obviously, going back again to mikemhu. We all have free will. When the Torah says to do something, then obviously it's not despicable. God forbid. It's the opposite. It's the best. It's the method that makes us be the best we can be, to be aligned with exactly the way the Creator and designer and engineer of life wants us to be. However, a person has free will. Free will means you can choose not to follow Torah, God forbid. You could choose something even worse, to use Torah to justify your own despicable behavior. So it's not that Torah Chaz v'Shalom is that. Torah is not even makabel tuma, actually. Torah is not even does not absorb impurities. But a person can portray. For example, a person can be. You look at the person and they project themselves as a God-fearing person, as a rabbi, as a chassid, as a teacher, and so on. And then they do something to hurt somebody, and they even find ways in Torah to say it was justifiable. It's not that Torah is justifiable. That person is finding a way, but it's just Torah. Like I remember somebody coming to me once and saying to me, where is it saying the Torah, Chassidus, and the Rebbe sichas that a wife has to listen to her husband? And I saw he was troubled. So I say, how do you know it says that? He says, because I know it says it. And I saw from what the way he's saying, I say, but my understanding, it says in Shulchan Aruch, Adam, a person, a husband, should honor his wife more than himself. He started yelling and screaming at me. So I saw he was trying to find a Torah source to justify his own mishigasin or his own cruelty. That's the vart. It's not that the Torah, God forbid, can be despicable. It could be a person looking, you could distort something and use it like a stick. It says, oh, the Torah says you have to punish someone. Let's go punish him. That's the point. Now, how could the Torah be used that way? The Torah came down Lamata, and as the Alter Rebbe says, Nosa v'yorda, from the high level, attacking Lamayel and Shamayim, and higher, the highest levels. Torah, of course, is pure Kedusha. And here, when it comes down, it's also pure Kedusha, but the Torah itself is mislabish, as the Alter Rebbe explains in the Geras HaKedesh 26. That's why Nigla the Torah is called Eitz Hadas Tevara. He says, how could you be called Nigla Torah Tevara? Because it deals with Tevara. It deals with people who argue. Shteina shel sheker, arguments, lies. The Gemara talks about people who steal, people who cheat. Not because the Torah, God forbid, the Torah is addressing that. So when the Torah addresses it, the Torah itself has manifested itself in a world that has to deal with criminal activity as well. And that includes, of course, the Torah being also vulnerable in a certain way, that a person can take Torah and turn it into Samovis if he uses the Torah the wrong way. The Torah always remains pure. And Halavai Admor Shebei Machzira Lemutav, it says, the luminary in Torah will bring him back to good. Ultimately, it will affect him. But meanwhile, a person, God forbid, can schlep Torah all the way, just like he can schlep God all the way into the worst places. So that's the answer to that question. Next question. My teenage friends are drowning. What can we do? Follow up to 213, 214. I'll just read a few comments on that. I won't read them all because of time. And I want to... teenage friends drowning. That teacher who didn't know what to do. So I spoke about a teacher who said, I know the problem, but I don't know what to do. Hi, Rabbi Jacobson, I am that teacher who wrote the comment that got so much flack and even made it onto your broadcast this week. We know, we just don't know what to do. And you suggested I shouldn't be teaching. Well, I didn't exactly put it that way. I said, firstly, I wasn't being personal. I was saying somebody who's in the role to teach and to influence students and they can't do it, maybe they have to look whether they're the right person. Anyway, let me read this letter and then I'll respond. I want to clarify, this teacher writes, that I regret writing it because it was so deeply misunderstood. What I was trying to say is that this girl shouldn't feel that we are oblivious, and she should know that we care and are searching for answers. It was written out of exasperation. I want to say that people have a very unfair attitude toward teachers. I am not a mashpia or magid shir. I'm an afternoon English teacher. But it's still so painful to watch what my students are going through. I do everything you suggested, but do you think it's really enough? Do you think I could sleep at night after reading this article? I am always trying, always asking for advice, reading up on it, giving it tons of thought every day. But we are up against a very great tide, and it is hard to reach every student. We need your help. To say we should just quit, to crush our spirits and write us off like that, that's how you cause bigger problems. You have no clue how much work and care we put into our students. How can you assume otherwise? Why would we be teaching if we didn't? I know it's cool to bash the establishment. You need to realize that some of us aren't ignorant and oblivious. We are just being honest. It would be dishonest to say we had the answers. If we did, this community would be a very different place. We are really trying, and if you can't give us credit, at least don't put us down publicly. Thank you. Okay, I apologize because I accept what you're writing. I did not in any way, God forbid, in any way try to suggest that a teacher with good intentions, as you're writing, is not doing the best they can. I was talking about the whole picture, and I wasn't talking about anyone individually. So I'm not going to justify it if it was taken that way, but let's make it clear. I am trying to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Meaning trying to talk about suggestions of how we can put our heads together. There are some teachers that are very capable of being a mashpia and addressing issues. Some teachers, maybe just more teachers. But I think everyone, even if you're an English teacher who may not have all the skills, you may be able to notice things. You may have certain students that respond to you and not to others. So let's get beyond any criticism and pointing fingers. That is all not the goal. That's not the goal of any of my programs, of any of my words. And if it was taken that way, as I said, I stand corrected. I absolutely do not mean it that way. We're trying to be productive. What can be done? Now, there may be teachers that are not competent. There may be teachers that actually hurt students. I've heard that too. I'm not going to determine that on the show like this without knowing the details. And more importantly, this has to be addressed by the anhola, by the faculty. Now, if there is a teacher like that, You know something? Sometimes you have to be strong because if the teacher is hurting students, that needs to be addressed. I just want to make that point clear. But I'm definitely not going to accuse anyone without knowing who we're talking about. I'm speaking in general terms that we have much work to do and we can address our students' needs. I'm very glad to hear you writing this. It shows that sincerity, it shows you care, it shows you stay up at night, and that's beautiful because I think that goes a long way. Caring is even more than competence. What do I mean by competence? You may not be trained to address every problem, but caring is the first step because you're caring, you can direct a student where to go, to whom to go. So that's my response to that. There's some more comments, but I'm going to go to one more about music. Well, I'll go to two more. A different generation. Although I consider myself an old lady, 59, I can say with certainty that your advice could have applied many generations ago too. I am so impressed with your gentle but firm approach. I wish someone would have given me the time of day. Although I stayed with the program, I know that if only one person took an interest in my life, in me and my life would have been took an interest in me, my life would have been much better. Please, all the people in Chinuch, listen. You want the children to listen. You listen to them. Thank you. Another person writes, from the 30-minute mark of last week's program, response to the system is broken. You should present a solution instead of saying we're in La La Land. The solution has already begun with new schools, seminaries, etc. opening up. Rumors fly about newer schools from those employed in the old system, but the results will speak for themselves. Okay. Another person writes back to that teacher who wrote what I just read. Not true. I know of a school where the principal took it seriously and is talking to every girl. 5 girls at the time about this. That is a caring principal. And then someone writes about the music lessons I addressed, which was, someone submitted a letter last week about the futility of teaching from kids music. The letter had a very pessimistic tone, and I couldn't disagree more. I grew up in a frum family with 10 kids, Kenan Hara. Baruch Hashem, over half of us have taken some kind of music or singing lessons at some point in our lives. It was a value of our parents to expose us to music, even though our school didn't have a music program. Most frum schools don't. Are any of us musicians as a career? Not necessarily. Are all of us still playing and practicing diligently today? Not necessarily either. But I can say that each of us has gained from it in our own way. Music is a great idea for yeshiva bachrim or anyone to have a creative outlet within Torah, and it shouldn't be put down. I think yeshivas in general have to be more open-minded about letting the students have more opportunities to be creative or learn a skill. Okay. There was some more follow-ups, which I will continue in later weeks. Let me go to the Chassidus question now. Parso'os. Parso'os is a concept in Kabbalah and Chassidus. It literally means partitions or separators or curtains or veils or shrouds or filters. All those are correct. Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Can you please explain the concept of Parso'os and Chassidus, its sources and its relevance to our lives? Sure. So firstly, the concept of Parso'os is in Zohar. We'll start with the sources. And it refers to the first parsa that's mentioned in the Torah is right in the beginning of Chumash. Yehi Rekiah b'seich hamayim. Rekiah, hamavdil. It separates, a firmament that separates between the higher waters and the lower waters, between land, the hamavdil. So that's the first, the havdalah, that's a parsa. The Zohar talks about it in the levels in higher than Atzilus, between Atik and Zoh, and many other levels which I'll discuss momentarily. There are other places, of course, in Zohar that discusses it. And then, of course, in Kisvei Arizal, you also have the Parso'os, as well as in Ramak and the Pardes. So Kabbalah, this is a fundamental principle of Parso'os. Let's put it into simplest English, and then I'll explain a little more of Chassidus. Look at the human structure. The best teacher is always the human being and nature, because that's what God created. And it's reflected, Mipsari erzelakah, from my flesh I behold God. Morabba my sicha, by looking at nature, we can understand the divine hand and engineer that created this, because it's the design of the divine. You're understanding the mind of God. And it reflects the whole Seder Ishtalshlus and the spiritual levels as well. That's what the structure of existence. What is the structure of existence? It's a very intricate structure, many details. In general, you have the concept of Eris and Kalim. What is that? Energy in a container. Vision in an eye. Hearing in an ear. The power to write in your fingers. Intelligence in your brain. Emotions in your heart. Eir and Keli. But then there's another element in every structure starting from the body, and those are we'll call them the separators, the membranes. There are membranes in the brain. There are membranes that separate the different parts of the brain. There's a membrane that separates intellect from emotions, the Meitzar Hagar in the throat. There's a membrane called the diaphragm, Chotzer HaKoved, separates between the lungs and the intestines. Membranes everywhere. What is membranes? Membranes, partitions, maybe a better word, because not everywhere is it a membrane. A partition means the structure, every structure has walls and doors and filters and gauges and valves. Just like when you put food down your throat, there's a point when your air pipe will close. As it processes down, there's the digestive organs open up. The same thing with the blood circulating and the nervous system. So when we look at machines, you'll see that not just is there a flow, but there's also gauges and valves that control the flow and regulate the flow. Those are the Parso'os in the human structure and in nature. It's a parsa that separates land from water. There's Parso'os that separate the sky, the atmospheres, the different atmospheres, the ozone layers, and so on. Layers. They're all Parso'os. What is it in Ruchnius? In Ruchnius Parso'os, in order to create structure, so besides the fact that God created many levels, Chochmah, Bina, Das, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, Asiya, which are dimensions, there has to also be these partitions that allow one dimension to turn into another dimension. Like he says in Torah, which is one of the first places in Chassidus that talks about the Parsa in Torah and Maamar Chassidus and Vayera. You can look it up, 14b and on. He says there that a parsa is necessary whenever there's a paradigm shift from one paradigm to another, from moichin to midas, intellect to emotions. You need a parsa. When things are just flowing, let's say water is flowing from a pitcher to a cup, you don't need a parsa necessarily. You may need a regulator, but you don't need a parsa, a partition. Partitions are necessary when there's a shift. So he gives the example of a partition. A parsa is like a moshel. A teacher is teaching an idea, so there's eris and kalim. The eris is the idea, the kalim are the words he's using, but then he sees the student doesn't get it, or the student is not on the level, so he gives him a moshel, an example. A moshel min inyan acher. If it's a moshel from the original idea, then it's not a moshel. You have to bring a moshel that the student says, the moshel I understand. So the moshel is from an alien or foreign idea that the student can relate to, but it's an example to help you understand the original idea. He says that's a parsa. The parsa between Atzilus and Biyah is that in Biyah you speak about a lakus, binyonim achedim that are not Atzilus. That's what he says, that language. In Atzilus you use the actual language, the language Atzilus relates to. In Biyah you can't use Atzilus language, so you need a language binyonim achedim that are not of Atzilus, but they are inferring and referring to Atzilus. So the moshel becomes a partition, a curtain, you can say. Just like you wear blinds, you wear sunglasses in order to filter the light. The moshel allows the idea to be conveyed to another paradigm, to another idiom. Then you can go back and climb the ladder and reconnect to the idea itself. So the parsa is, on one hand, it's a concealer or a channeler. On the other hand, it ultimately will reveal the idea. As he explains the difference between parsa and tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is a concealer. A parsa is a channeler, or a veil, or a curtain, or a separator. The Parso'os, for example, that are often described, are the three main Parso'os, like you have in the Beis HaMikdash or in the Mishkan, between Holy of Holies and the Holy, and between the Holy and the El Moed, and of course the El Moed, and outside. So you have three. The three are also compared to the three Big Day Kaddish. Vasisa Big Day Kaddish, Moshe made garments for Aaron, the Chachmei Lev, the craftsman made, and Bnei Yisrael made garments. These are again three Parso'os. Three general Parso'os, usually between superconscious and conscious. That's between Keser and Chochmah, between Moichin and Midas, which is the Meitzar Hagar, the throat. The first one is the membrane between higher than intellect and intellect. And the third one is bringing it down between Atzilus and Biyah, the diaphragm, the Chotzer HaKoved, that brings it from Midas and to Malchus all the way into Biyah. So you have three in general, but there are many more Parso'os. And they're discussed at length in Hemshech Ayin Beis. And I'll give you the chapters. In 107, 108, he talks about it. In chapter 137, and then in chapter 416. After that, there are no more chapters, so the Maimorim, Truma and Tetzava, Kisisa, Odom Kiyiya, Achrei, Svartem, Kisavoyim, Bamidbar, all Tafresh Ayin Hey in volume 2, in the volume 2 of Ayin Beis, pages 876 through 896, and then 956 through 987. It's a lengthy discussion. I'm actually learning it and teaching it right now, so I'm right b'teicha in Yanim. By the way, if you want to hear the recordings of the Ayin Beis, you just email us and we'll be happy to send them to you as they're taught. We have a WhatsApp group where we are, where all the audio recordings are posted, and there also will all be, many of them have been posted, and many more will be posted on our Ayin Beis website that we, on the YouTube channel that we have for Ayin Beis. So there he discusses at length these ideas and explains the purpose of the parsa is, number one purpose is in order to create these partitions so a structure should be sound. Without these partitions, the structures can be overwhelmed one by the other, so you need to have these different partitions and separators. And there he talks about it in so many different levels, including the reshes on the Mizbeach, which was the screen on the Mizbeach, and many other places where he talks about the Micah. This is like when you build a gate around the roof, and both in Alpi Chassidus and Alpi Nigla and so on and so forth, and talks about the different Parso'os, including on the highest levels, called the beard is a level of Parsa, the Payas. You have the Avir al Gabe Kroima, which is the space above the membrane, above the space between the skull and the intellect, the super-intellect, between super-conscious and conscious, between Atik and between Atik and Aryeh, between Aryeh and Chochmah. And of course, the three general ones that I just referred to, which is the Keser, the one that is most translucent. The next parsa is a little less translucent, which is between Meichen, intellect, and Midas, and the third parsa, which is the most opaque, and that is between Atzilus and Biyah. But there are even more Parso'os that go down, even to the point of complete darkening the flow as you go downwards. So that's the general gist of the Parso'os, and the goal is, like he explains, is Zichu Chaparsa. We want to create a Dira B'Tachtenim, transform the world. You have to transform, and you have to refine the Parsa. How do you refine the Parsa? Through our work. By not just accepting the minimal flow, but working our way back and working through the Parsa, refining it so we can identify, through the Moshel, you come to understand the Nimshal, and you climb the ladder from one level to the next by refining and expanding these partitions that allow you then to retrace your steps and connect back to the highest levels, even before the Tzimtzum, as Ayin Beis explains. Let us now do the three essays, two in Hebrew, one in English this week. The first essay is Das, the theme of Das, by Aryeh, Yonatan, Chadad, age 20, Migdal, Haemek, Israel, the Yeshiva student. So the essay talks about Das as an internalization, to how a path of internalization and application. And it gives first a case study of in general. He says the purpose of this discourse is how to take an idea and turn it into something that you actually internalize and own and actualize. And how can we also do this both for ourselves, both as parents to our children and students and educators to our students? To be able to take an idea, a theory, an ethereal theory, and turn it into a personal owning it and complete integration. So he speaks about the levels of intelligence, Chochmah, Bina, Das, and the recognition and clarity Das brings beyond Chochmah and Bina. Internalization. Adam Yoda is Chava. Then he goes on to speak about the dichotomy, the dissonance between intellect and internalization, and how we counter that, both in the world of education, in the world of communication, in our social lives, and really does a pretty thorough job in many different areas. And then the third part is the solution through his bonanus and through a series of steps, which is contemplation, concentration, effort, understanding well an idea, which is going through the steps here, and how to bring it into action. He gives a whole methodology of how to actually use Das as a tool of internalization and naturalization. So this essay and all the other essays are posted at meaningfullife.com/mylife. And if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, we will send out the new essays as they are posted. The second essay is called Rayon Chassidus by Dovid Olidart, age 26, Chadera, Israel, Shliach of the Rebbe in Chadera. Yeah. Now, Rayon Chassidus, this means idea in Chassidus. What he does is a very wonderful essay where he takes the idea of how we can actually actualize ourselves and to recognize, are we really living up to our greatest potential? And he uses the idea of Tayu and Tikkun in Chassidus from the Maamar Chassidus Tafresh Memtes, that Tayu, many people think just means yesh, there's no humility. He says, no, it's misplaced humility. Sometimes humility is so humble that it doesn't fulfill what the divine mission is. And explains bittul two ways, there's healthy bittul and unhealthy bittul. Meaning the two different ways, you cannot annihilate yourself or annihilate. You have to be somebody to be able to be bottle. He discussed in a very nice way the balance necessary to achieve that. So that's essay number 2. And finally, essay number 3 in English is The Perfectionist Geulah by Bassie, Yahel, age 27, Kingston, Pennsylvania. Full-time homemaker, part-time editor, and teacher. And of course, she tackles the issue of the perfectionist produces impeccable work. This essay contains the Chassidic toolbox to free the perfectionist, definitions of concepts in Chassidus that will be used to help the perfectionist, contemplation, Yismach Yisrael Be'esav, B'tochen, Simcha, Peretz's Geder, personal Geulah and Geulah, why applying Chassidus concepts helps, application, practical real-life rut scenarios the perfectionists may experience and their solutions using the Chassidic toolbox. And finally, check up a worksheet that utilizes the perfectionist skills in order to track progress and remain focused on the godly plan. Very nicely done, and one of the top essays, of course, and goes through the different steps necessary to be able to channel this perfectionist need, but to make it productive instead of being trapped by it. Also with some case studies and scenarios. So well done, and I commend you for that. And it's written at the end, she signs off, written by a freed by Chassidus perfectionist. Very nice. Okay, so that covers the essays. With that, we shall conclude this week's episode of My Life Chassidus Applied 215. We are here every week, except when I announce otherwise, because due to Yontif are the reasons that we continue every week. And it's always an honor to share a few words, and please help us, support us, be generous in your support at meaningfullife.com/sponsorship. We'll be here next week. Will be a special Gimel Tammuz edition, being that next Sunday will be the Sunday before Shabbos Gimel Tammuz, and we should already be zeicher that we should not have to talk about any of the darker elements of Gimel Tammuz, only the positive, which is the way of Chassidus. Everyone have a very blessed week, and until next Sunday, everyone be gebenched. Thank you very much.